They say the man who never raises his voice is usually the one who never needed to. I have found that to be true more times than I can count, and I've watched plenty of people mistake my quiet for foolishness, my patience for weakness, my old truck for proof that there's nothing behind the wheel worth respecting. Those people are always the ones I end up remembering longest. My name is Walter Briggs. I'm 64 years old, and I've spent most of my life being underestimated on purpose. I drive a 1998 Ford F-150 that my son-in-law has offered to help me trade in no fewer than 6 times. It's the color of a dust storm that gave up halfway through. The bench seat has a permanent dent shaped like me. I live in the same house I built with my own hands 28 years ago, out past the county line where the mailboxes are a quarter-mile apart and the only traffic is deer. My neighbor, Hollis Pratt, retired from the co-op, told me once over the fence that I was the poorest-looking rich man he never met. I told him I wasn't rich. He laughed. I laughed. We talked about his bees for a while, and I drove the truck home. Here's what Hollis doesn't know. What the men at the diner counter don't know. What the boy who sold me a lawnmower last spring and tried twice to upsell me on a riding model didn't know when I said the push mower was just fine and thanked him kindly. I own Ferris Holdings Agriculture, cold storage, a controlling stake in 3 regional trucking companies, land in 2 states that nobody's bothered to look up because nobody thinks to. My name's not on a building anywhere. No profile in the business journals. No ribbon cuttings with my photo. I built it that way on purpose. The same way you build a fence slow, post by post, so it holds. Ferris Holdings is worth a little north of $2 billion. I drive a truck with a cracked windshield and a radio that only gets the AM gospel station, and there is not one thing about that I would change. Now let me tell you about my daughter. Dana Briggs Whitfield is 33 years old, and she is, without a shadow of exaggeration, the best thing I ever had a hand in making. Smarter than her mother and I combined, and her mother, God rest her, she's been gone 6 years now, was plenty smart. Dana's got a laugh you can hear 2 rooms away before you even know what's funny. When she was 8, she talked me into an extra hour of bedtime by pointing out, correctly, that I myself didn't go to bed until midnight. So what exactly was the logic? I remember thinking, this one's going to run something someday. I was right about that. What I didn't see coming was who she'd end up married to. 4 years back, Dana brought home Colton Whitfield. I want to be fair to Colton. I try to be a fair man. So let me say the kindest true thing I can say about him. Colton Whitfield shakes your hand like he's still deciding if you're worth the effort. He's 37, tall, the kind of handsome that comes from a gym membership and good dental work. He wears a watch that costs more than my truck, and within the first 10 minutes of meeting me, he'd mentioned his father's boat, his fraternity, and a golf trip to Pebble Beach. He said Pebble Beach, the way some men say the name of a woman they're still getting over. I nodded. I told him that sounded like a fine time. 8 months after he married my daughter, Colton Whitfield was made regional director of Meridian Cold Chain. Now, here's where you need to lean in close, because this is the part that matters. Meridian Cold Chain is a subsidiary of Ferris Holdings, one of mine. Colton went through what looked, from the outside, like a completely ordinary hiring process, a search firm, 3 rounds of interviews, background checks, a board sign-off that looked as clean as anything you'd ever see. What nobody knew, what Colton still doesn't know to this day, is that I sat behind every piece of that process like a man behind a one-way mirror. I read every reference. I reviewed every interview note. I approved his salary myself. Then I went home, put on my work gloves, and spent the evening replacing a fence post that had rotted through. Colton texted me that night. Big news, got the regional director job. Dana's over the moon. I told him I was proud of him. Congratulations, son. Then I put the phone on the counter and went back to my post hole. I want to be honest. I gave the boy a real chance. I've hired enough people in my life to know first impressions don't tell you much. People surprise you. I've been surprised plenty. Colton did not surprise me. He confirmed me, which is a different thing entirely, and it happened slow, the way rot happens slow, until one evening, at a company dinner he believed he introduced me to a junior manager, and before I could get a word out, Colton said, "This is Dana's dad. He does a little farming. Then he steered the man away like I was a coat rack that had wandered too far from the wall. I smiled. I said nothing. I filed it away. But the day that mattered, the one that changed the whole shape of things, came about 3 months later. I'd stopped by the Meridian offices to handle a piece of business quietly, through one of my people, and I was walking that hallway the way I walk every hallway, unremarkable, unhurried. An old man, in a canvas jacket, that nobody looks at twice. I heard Colton's voice around the corner, talking to somebody. Dana's dad, he was saying, and I could hear him smiling through it. Harmless old guy. I think he had some land, did okay for himself once, but that's about the ceiling on that story. Drives this ancient truck, wears the same 3 shirts. Dana feels like she's got to look after him a little, which, family's family. I straightened my jacket. I walked back the way I'd come. Did okay for himself once. That's about the ceiling. I carried those words with me for the better part of 5 months. I come from patient people. My father used to tell me, Walter, the creek doesn't argue with the stone. It just keeps moving. One day the stone's gone, and the creek's still there. I kept moving. The dinner invitation came on a Sunday. Over the phone, Dana's voice bright as a porch light. Colton's parents, Richard and Vivian Whitfield, wanted to host us at their place out on Cedar Point Lake. The whole family, get everybody together, one big happy occasion. Richard had made his money in commercial insurance before he retired into a life of talking about the money he'd made in commercial insurance. Vivian's whole personality, as far as I could tell, ran on square footage and the right kind of tile. You'll love them, Dad, Dana said. I'm sure I will, sweetheart, I said, and I already knew several things about Richard and Vivian Whitfield that would have made that sentence a hard one for Dana to finish, but I kept it to myself. I told her I'd be there. I meant it. Then Colton called me directly, which was itself unusual enough to be worth noting. Friendly, easy, the tone of a man about to say something he already knows, is a little insulting, but has decided to say it anyway. Hey, just a heads up on Saturday, he said. My folks are pretty traditional, old-school types. Might be worth dressing it up a notch. Nothing crazy. Just sharper than the usual flannel, you know. A pause. Colton, I said, pleasant as Sunday. I appreciate you looking out. Course, he said, relieved. Just want everybody comfortable. I understand completely, I said. I hung up. I stood in front of the mirror by my front door a good long while. Then I walked past the 2 good suits hanging in the back of my closet. The navy one, the charcoal one, the one I wore the day Ferris Holdings bought out its biggest competitor 8 years back, and I pulled out my plainest clothes. Pressed jeans, a clean button-up, my good boots that were still just work boots. I laid them out for Saturday. Then I walked to the truck, put my hand flat on the hood the way you'd rest a hand on a horse's neck before a hard ride. We've got a dinner, old girl, I said. Dress code's humble. We're already there. Because here is what Colton didn't understand. What Richard and Vivian didn't understand. What nobody sitting at that table was going to understand until it was too late to matter. I wasn't dressing plain because it was all I had. I was dressing plain because I wanted to watch exactly who these people were when they thought there was nothing on the line. And something in me, 40 years of something, told me they were about to show me everything I needed to see. Saturday came in quiet, the way the important ones always do. No fanfare, no warning. I was up at 5:30 like every day for 40 years. Coffee black, no sugar, same as my father drank it. Sat at my kitchen table and watched the light come up slow over the backfield. I was calm. I'm always calm. It's the one weapon nobody ever sees coming. I dressed the way I'd laid it out. Looked at myself in the mirror and thought, that's exactly right. Walked out to the truck, engine turned over with its usual complaint, and I drove out to Cedar Point Lake. The Whitfield place sat behind a stone gate at the end of a drive lined with hedges trimmed so precise they looked angry about it. A young man in a polo shirt stood near the door, not quite valet, not quite butler, doing the job of sizing up every car that rolled in. He looked at my truck, looked at me, looked back at the truck, and I watched him do the math and come up short. Evening, sir, he said, recovering fast. I can park that for you. Much obliged, son, I said, handing him the keys. She pulls right a little. Don't let it worry you. He nodded like a man trying hard not to have any further opinions about my truck. Richard opened the door before I could knock. Big man, 71, silver hair, the kind of handshake that lasts exactly as long as it needs to, and not a second more. Walter, he said, warm in that assembled way. So glad you made it. Come on in. The house did what the driveway promised. Vaulted ceilings, art chosen to be admired rather than loved, a staircase that curved like it knew people were watching. Vivian came gliding in from the sitting room, took both my hands in hers the way people do when they want the touch to do the work sincerity should be doing. Walter, she said, we've heard so much. You're just as sweet as Dana said. Sweet. First word out of her mouth. Not accomplished, not interesting. Sweet, the word you use for old dogs and elderly uncles who've lost the thread of the conversation. Thank you, Vivian, I said. You've got a beautiful home. She beamed. People who've built their whole identity on their possessions never tire of hearing the possessions praised. Dana crossed the room and wrapped her arms around me the way she has since she was 4. I held on a beat longer than usual. You look good, Dad. So do you, sweetheart. Colton appeared behind her, and I caught the flicker half a second, gone as fast as it came. The look of a man who'd specifically asked me to dress up and gotten a canvas jacket instead. Then the recovery smile. Walter, glad you made it, he said, clapping my shoulder for an audience. Dad's got something special open. Something special turned out to be the theme of the whole night. The wine, the meal, the house, the family, all of it special. Everything except me. We sat down to a table set with the kind of formal precision that takes hours and exists mainly to remind certain guests of the distance between themselves and their hosts. I unfolded my napkin. I looked around at these people who'd invited me in, and I made myself invisible. Not because they did it to me, because I let them. I've learned that the most dangerous thing a man can do at a table full of people underestimating him is correct that mistake too early. So I sat. I smiled. I asked polite questions. I praised wine I hadn't tasted yet. And I watched. Richard led the table the way men like Richard always do, from the front. Loud, absolutely sure. Nobody's ever once told him he talks too much. He went on about interest rates, a trip to Nova Scotia, and Colton's instincts at Meridian. The boys completely turned that division around, Richard said, swirling his glass. Leadership's just in him, I think. Some people have it. He looked over at me when he said it, informative, casual, the kind of look meant to draw a line without saying so out loud. I nodded appreciatively. That's wonderful, I said. You must be very proud. Vivian turned to Dana with a smile shaped like a compliment and sharpened like a blade. And Dana, it must feel so secure, having a husband who provides so well. Not every girl's so lucky. The table went quiet half a beat too long. Dana smiled graciously, but I saw her eyes. I picked up my water glass and said not one word, because the folder hadn't come out yet, and I knew, the way you know weather's coming, that once it did, that table was never going back to how it looked before. By dessert, I'd been sitting there 2 hours, 2 hours of nodding, of laughing at Richard's stories that weren't as funny as Richard believed, of playing the harmless old man in the canvas jacket, and not one soul at that table suspected there was anything underneath it. Then Richard reached under his chair, and I felt that old, familiar shift, the one where a night stops being an evening and starts being a story. He set a leather folder on the table, smoothed it flat with his palm, and slid it toward me. Walter, he said, voice dropping into a register he'd clearly rehearsed. There's something we'd like to talk through, as a family. I didn't touch it yet. Vivian's hands folded still on the table. Colton sat up straighter, working hard at looking unbothered. Dana glanced at me, then at her father-in-law. I looked at her hands in her lap. They weren't still. Colton's got a vision, Richard said. A real one. His own venture, built from the ground up, the kind of chance that comes along once. He nodded at the folder. What we're proposing is simple. Dana's future inheritance, used as collateral to secure the initial funding. Clean, legal, all above board. He leaned forward. We just need your blessing, Walter, as her father. Then he looked at Vivian, whose smile had the fixed quality of something painted on, then at Colton, calm and certain, already spending money he'd decided was coming. And I thought, you have no earthly idea whose table you're sitting at. I picked up the folder, opened it, read every page slow, While the candles burned down and the clock on the wall counted seconds, nobody dared fill. Then I closed it, set it gently back down, took a slow sip of water, and looked at Richard with the warmest smile I own. I appreciate the thought that went into this, I said. I'll give it a careful look. Richard let out a breath like he'd been holding it an hour. Colton's shoulders dropped half an inch. Vivian reached for her wine, believing the hard part was over. They thought they'd won. I finished my water, made pleasant conversation another 20 minutes, thanked Vivian for a lovely evening, shook Richard's hand full grip this time, my eyes on his 1 second longer than he expected. He had no idea what that second meant. I said nothing for 16 days, not one word, not a ripple. I split wood on the weekend, had coffee with Hollis on Wednesday, drove the truck to the feed store and back. On day 5, Colton texted, "Hey, any thoughts on the proposal? Exciting stuff, right?" I waited 3 hours and wrote back, "Still looking it over, son. These things take time." He sent a thumbs up. I set the phone down and made a call, not to Colton, not to Richard, but to 3 men who sat on Meridian's board, men who'd known me 20 years and understood that when I called direct, it wasn't a social visit. "Run the audit," I said. "Full scope. Start today." Then I went back out to split wood. Because here's what Colton Whitfield didn't know. What Richard and Vivian, toasting themselves out at Cedar Point, didn't know. I had written Colton's employment contract myself, every clause, including one buried on page 11, a non-compete and fiduciary duty clause, I drafted 12 years before Colton Whitfield ever set foot in my daughter's life. A clause built exactly for men who think they're smarter than the room they're standing in. I'd been patient 12 years. I could manage 16 more days. What the audit turned up took 9 days to fully document, and when the report landed on my kitchen table, I sat with it a long while, not from surprise, but to be sure, dead sure, before I did what came next. Colton had spent 6 months quietly building a side venture using Meridian's client contacts, Meridian's equipment scheduling software, and Meridian's time to set up a competing cold storage brokerage that would go head-to-head with Ferris Holdings itself. Quiet, careful, certain no one above him was paying attention. He'd forgotten the one rule that matters most. You cannot build a secret inside a house that belongs to the man you're hiding it from. Every email, every late-night login, every meeting on the clock, all of it documented, all of it sitting in a folder. On the morning I put on the charcoal suit and drove the truck to Meridian's headquarters. I parked in the reserved spot out front, the one marked Ferris Holdings, the one Colton had walked past 3 mornings a week for 4 years, without once wondering whose name belonged there. I walked into the boardroom and sat at the head of the table, 2 board members to my left, our attorney to my right, the folder squared in front of me. 4 minutes later, Colton walked in believing he was headed for a routine check-in. He scanned the room, the board, the lawyer, the papers, and then his eyes landed on me, sitting in his chair, at his table, in a suit he'd never once seen. I watched the understanding move across his face floor by floor. The hiring process, the contract, the audit, his father's proud toast, the envelope on the dinner table, every moment of 4 years arriving all at once on a Thursday morning. The silence held 10 full seconds. I let every one of them land. "Sit down, Colton," I said. He sat. "I'm going to say this once," I told him. "Not because I'm angry angers for men who didn't see it coming. And I saw this coming the day you told me my truck pulled a little strange. Meridian Cold Chain belongs to Ferris Holdings. Ferris Holdings belongs to me. Has for 17 years. The title you carry, the salary you draw, the whole reputation you've spent 4 years building around yourself, exists because I built the ground under it. I gave you every resource a man could ask for, and for 6 months, you used every one of them to build something meant to compete against the very thing that made you." I closed the folder. "The clause in your contract covers everything the audit found. Our legal team is ready to take this all the way, if that's what you'd like." Every ounce of the confidence he'd walked in with was gone. He looked, for the first time since I'd known him, young, small, a long way from Pebble Beach. "However," I said, "I've got no interest in ruining you. I'm interested in clarity. So here's how this goes. You resign today, quiet, professional. Your name stays clean, and none of this leaves this room, or we go the other way, and every page in this folder becomes public record." 33. He looked at the board, at the attorney, back at me, and something moved across his face I hadn't expected. Not anger, not some last performance of defiance, shame, real shame, the quiet kind that only shows up when a man finally sees himself clear and doesn't care for the view. "I'll resign," he said, and the words cost him something to say. "Good," I said. I stood, buttoned my jacket, picked up the folder. At the door I stopped. "One more thing. Your father's proposal, using Dana's inheritance as collateral, I let that sit exactly as long as it needed to. My attorneys moved everything into her name this morning. Irrevocable. An account only she can touch. Your father's proposal is now a document about money that doesn't exist where he thinks it does. Tell your folks I said thank you for dinner. The brisket was excellent." I drove home in the truck. The engine cleared its throat at the first turn of the key, same as always, and the radio found the gospel station right where I'd left it. I sat in the driveway a minute, just sat there, 28 years of being the man nobody looked at twice, knowing exactly who I was the whole time. I put my hand on the dash. Good girl, I thought. Then I went inside and called my daughter. She showed up 20 minutes later and found me at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee already poured. She sat across from me and studied my face a long moment, the way she studied it since she was small, reading it like she already half knew the answer. I told her everything, from the beginning, the company, the hiring, the contract clause, written 12 years before Colton ever walked through our door, the audit, the boardroom, the money moved into her name. When I finished, she sat quiet a long while. Then she looked up and asked the one question I'd been carrying the answer to for 30 years. "Dad, why didn't you ever tell me any of it?" I looked down at my coffee, out at the dark field, back at my daughter, her mother's eyes in her face, that laugh that fills 2 rooms. "Because I wanted you to build your own life," I said, "not one handed to you because of what I own. I never wanted you looking at me and seeing a company. I wanted you seeing your father," she cried. I held her hand across that table and let her. I thought about Richard Whitfield, sitting very still out at Cedar Point. Vivian, setting her glass down slow. Colton, trying to find the words to explain to his parents how the quiet old man in the canvas jacket turned out to be the one person in that dining room they should never, not for 1 second, have underestimated. I thought about all of it, and then I let it go, because the only thing that mattered in the whole world was sitting right across from me, hands wrapped around a warm cup, eyes red, smiling anyway. My daughter. The best thing I ever built. Some men don't look like much. They just are what they are, all the way through. And sooner or later, the ones who bet against that always find out the hard way.